What's up everyone, this is Joseph with the Cardinal Rule. In this video, I'm going to go over my projections for the final 53-man roster after the cuts that are coming up this week for the Arizona Cardinals. Now this is a video that is destined to age poorly. I'm going to be wrong on some of these. But I'm going to discuss why I picked the players I picked, and I'm also going to mention at the end of the video who I think are the next men up. These are the players who I think will be on the roster if there's an injury, or if I'm wrong about one of these other players. Essentially, these are the most likely candidates to make the roster if I'm wrong about one of these other players. So, without further ado, let's get into it. At quarterback, I think they're going to keep two quarterbacks. Obviously, Kyler Murray is going to be the starter, and I think Colt McCoy is going to be the backup. Now, there has been a question of whether they would keep a third quarterback with Chris Streveler on the active roster. And that is a possibility. I could be wrong on this, obviously. But I think they're going to try to get Streveler through to the practice squad and go with two quarterbacks on the active roster. Next up is running back. I think they're going to keep four running backs: Chase Edmonds, James Conner, Eno Benjamin, and Jonathan Ward. Now, over the last two seasons, they have only kept three running backs on their opening day roster, though later in the season, they've often had four or more running backs on the roster. I think based on their performance, though, they're going to keep four of them, but we'll see. Next, we have wide receiver. I think they're going with 6 wide receivers, and I'm not going too cute with this one. I think it's going to be Hopkins, Green, Kirk, Moore, Isabella, and Johnson. Now, Greg Dortch has looked really good in the preseason, and it wouldn't shock me if he made the roster. But I think they're probably going with those 6 that I've listed. Now, tight end, there is a legitimate question as to whether they'll keep 2 or 3. They've gone both directions in the past, and there isn't a clear favorite to be that third tight end. But with that said, I did have them going with 3, with Max Williams, Darrell Daniels, and Demetrius Harris as that third tight end. Now, with the offensive line position, I have them keeping 10 of them. Rodney Hudson, DJ Humphries, Kelvin Beachum, Justin Pugh, Justin Murray, Brian Winters, Josh Jones, Max Garcia, Joshua Miles, and Sean Harlow. He's probably the one surprise name. He's a guy who was more of a practice squad guy in the past, but he's played really well during the preseason. He's a former 4th-round pick of the Falcons, and I think he's earned a spot on this roster. Next position is interior defensive line. I have them keeping 6 linemen: J.J. Watt, Jordan Phillips, Lecky Fotu, Rashad Lawrence, Corey Peters, and Zach Allen. Now, Michael Dogby is a possibility here, and you'll see him on my next man up list. And he's one of the toughest omissions for me. He played really well during the preseason, and he's a guy who I could see another team picking up if we try to put him through to waivers. Next up, we have linebackers. Now, here we include both edge rushers and inside linebackers, and I've kind of grouped them together, although certainly they have different roles. I have the Cardinals keeping 9 total linebackers, and this list includes Isaiah Simmons, Zaven Collins, Chandler Jones, Marcus Golden, Devin Kennard, Jordan Hicks, Dennis Gardick, and Ezekiel Turner. Now, the toughest omission here is rookie Victor Dimukeje, but unfortunately this is another one of those places where the numbers game is just really tough. It's hard to find room for all of these players that we'd like to see on the roster. If I'm wrong, he's probably one of those first players I'd expect to be on this roster, but it wouldn't shock me if they did find a way to keep him on the roster. Next up is cornerback. Now, over the last 2 seasons, the Cardinals have only kept 4 active cornerbacks going into the first week of the season, but I think they're going to keep 5 this time around. That includes Malcolm Butler, Byron Murphy Jr., Robert Alford, Marco Wilson, and Tay Gowan. Now, a couple notes here. At the time I'm recording this, Robert Alford is on the COVID reserve list, and it's possible that he's going to remain on that list through the cuts. And if that happens, I could see them going with 4 cornerbacks initially and keeping someone at another position, like Michael Dogby or Victor Dimukeje. But as soon as he's off that list, I think Alford is going to be one of those 53 men on the roster. Now, the other question mark here is Tay Gowan. He hasn't performed exceptionally in the preseason, but he has looked competent. And I could see them trying to get him through the practice squad. But my concern is if the Cardinals try to get him through waivers to get him on the practice squad, another team might claim him. And I think the Cardinals probably recognize this. So for that reason, I think they're going to keep him on that initial 53-man roster because they don't want to lose him. Next up is the safety position. Now, this is probably one of the toughest rooms to figure out. There's a lot of good players here, some excellent special teams contributors, and this is probably the room where I have the least confidence in my picks. Now, there's a couple players who are obvious: Budda Baker, Jalen Thompson, and I think Chris Banjo and James Wiggins are probably locks to make this roster. But I'm only keeping 5 players at this position in my projections, and that means the last 3 players are competing for 1 spot. And the player that I have making the roster is Sean Williams. Now, I could see Charles Washington or Deontay Thompson being that player. And again, this was a really tough choice for me. But I think Sean Williams has the most experience starting, and that they're going to look at it from the perspective if Jalen Thompson gets injured again, we'd like to have a guy who has experience starting who can step in and play alongside Budda Baker. But again, we'll see how that plays out. The last position group is special teams. There's no surprises here. Matt Prater, Andy Lee, Aaron Brewer. Now, the last group I want to talk about is what I'm calling the next men up. As I mentioned before, these are the players who I think are close to making the roster, and if someone who I've projected to make the roster is injured, is on the COVID list, or I'm just wrong about someone and they don't make the roster, these are some of the players I think are most likely to actually be the replacement in that case. So this list includes Michael Dogby, Victor Dimukeje, wide receiver Greg Dortch, tight end Ross Travis, quarterback Chris Streveler, safeties Deontay Thompson and Charles Washington, and cornerback Darqueze Dennard. Now, it's going to be interesting to see who ends up making the roster, and you can bet I'm going to be watching it with great anticipation. So who do you think is going to make the roster? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on The Cardinal Rule.